said, wait, what do you mean this is the Gettysburg of the revolution? This is the turning point. I said, this can't be the singular turning point of the revolution. And of course, there were other major inflection points or tipping points in the revolution. The 10 days of Washington crossing the Delaware, the Battle of Trenton, the Battle of Princeton, and of course, a strong case is to be made for all of the fighting and the like that was done under General Nathaniel Greene down in the South, particularly in South Carolina. But I think, again, if we have intellectual honesty, we don't get to Yorktown if we don't have Saratoga. So I couldn't believe. I certainly knew that Benjamin Franklin had been dispatched to France and was striking out for a good period of the time that he was there. But I didn't know it was Saratoga, and certainly an overwhelming and complete victory, as Kevin Weddle puts it, a strategic victory. And really, the first major strategic victory of the war was Saratoga. We had certainly had earlier victories, but they were not game changers. And so I couldn't believe that here, right under my nose, being a proud native New Yorker, that this victory was what reset the revolution. I said it on the last podcast, and I like to stir the pot a little bit. But we often say about the Battle of Lexington, right? That was a shot heard round the world. And I don't know if anyone has said this before, and of course the case could be made for Yorktown, but I think Saratoga is the surrender that was heard round the world. Because for your listeners, right, we went from being a colonial conflict, the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War, the American War for Independence, and went from being a colonial conflict, a grudge between the colonists, airing their grievances, and initially civilly and then spilling blood, but with the crown, with the British crown. But it then became a world war after Saratoga, with not only the French intervening militarily on our behalf, but of course the Dutch financing a large part of the war, and then the Spanish independently declaring war on the British crown, and then even a kingdom in southern Italy, the kingdom of Mysore. So it's an unbelievable story after Saratoga. So I'll pause, but the more I learned about the history, it was mind blowing. What a great story it is.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. I think that's a great way to put it. The surrender heard around the world, because it really did reverberate around the globe. And I'm right there with you. That's one of the things that I've found so much joy in when starting this podcast. Is I've always been a very patriotic guy. I've always had a fascination with American history, and when I started this journey of mine, I was always a history buff. I read and I had a decent understanding of American history, but as I've progressed and had guests on and read their books, I've found stories that I didn't necessarily learn about in school or learn about in depth in school or on my own. And especially, in recent memory with Saratoga 2 weeks ago with Kevin, reading that book and discovering this story and how profound of an implication it had on American history was mind-blowing to me, because it really was the turning point. I mean, I know it's called the turning point, but it really was. It had huge impacts, and you're right, we wouldn't have had Yorktown without Saratoga.
Well, let's talk about that for a moment if we could. And by the way, another plug for Kevin's book is that Kevin doesn't want to be known as an academician, even though he has a PhD from Princeton, studied under the venerable historian, I think, James McPherson. And then he was one of the more beloved and distinguished professors at the Army War College. But he's a soldier's soldier. He was a combat commander, and he's done expert staff rides to Civil War and World War II sites around the world. So he's also very charismatic, especially so for an historian. So he has really, he's very gifted not only with his writing, but the clarity with which he speaks about these topics. But so I always want to tell listeners, and I always defer, of course, to the National Park Service and to the very, very able staff at the Saratoga National Historical Park and the Saratoga Battlefield. But as I've being a kid from Long Island, and knowing a lot about all of New York State, I do see a connectivity. I don't want to just focus on what was happening in the Northern Department in the late fall of 1776 and 1777. I take a step back, as others have done, and you realize the Americans had a disastrous invasion of Quebec. It can't be overstated what a catastrophe that was. And then psychologically, and even just as the opening, one of the phases of the war, especially after the euphoria of capturing Fort Ticonderoga so early. But then we have the very bitter, protracted Boston siege, and that was a terrible time. And but then then we the war really takes on a whole different footing when the British bring in a massive force under General Howe into Staten Island and then the greater New York City, with a fleet larger than the Spanish Armada. And the Battle of Long Island, the Battle of Brooklyn. Again, you can't overstate what a incredible disaster that was for the Americans. 3,000 killed, and again, ultimately, many, many taken prisoners. So much so that throughout the course of the war, no less than 10,000, but I think the number is believed to be higher, would suffer and die on incredibly wretched prison ships in New York Harbor. And so that's the backdrop. And then it's going so badly, when we declare independence, just a month or so before the Battle of Long Island. So the very aspirational. And of course, the signers knew that if this doesn't go well, as Benjamin Franklin says, we better all hang together, or we assuredly will hang separately. And so Franklin is then dispatched to France in a desperate diplomatic effort in October of 1776, shortly after Nathan Hale is hung in New York City. I mean, this whole enterprise is going very badly, and of course, the suffering American army was encamped outside of Philadelphia in a Valley Forge. Washington, we can't overstate the heroics of what was accomplished on Christmas night of 1776, and then the victories at Trenton and at Princeton. And they certainly kept the campfires burning and then some. The heroism, the leadership, and for morale, but it didn't reset the war. I mean, these were tactical victories, maybe strategic psychologically, and certainly I don't want to understate the importance of those earlier victories. But when you get into, and this is a great pivot. Let me conclude quickly. But when you get into the spring of 1777, I think certainly historians know with the benefit of hindsight, but even at the time, there was a clear understanding that General Howe was going to be on the move in that spring and summer. And Washington's main army was going to be in the crosshairs. And in fact, that was General Howe's objective, was to find and destroy Washington's main army, and by extension, the continental capital of Philadelphia, the nation's largest city, which he ultimately did, succeed in achieving those objectives. He didn't destroy Washington's army, but they were terribly battered after a number of battles. But at the same time, so we had this gathering storm there of Howe on the move, and they didn't know. He did a feint. They didn't know if he was coming overland via New Jersey. He ultimately went by water through Maryland and Delaware up into Philadelphia. But at the same time, General John Burgoyne had received approval from London to have a campaign, an operation from Quebec with the objective of seizing Albany. And so this is the movie or the film that's played at the Saratoga National Historical Park for 20 minutes in the Visitor Center is called Something More at Stake. And so something indeed was more at stake that summer, with this very large gathering storm of General Howe and General Burgoyne. And here's the point. If General Burgoyne succeeds in taking Albany, and there's a lot of recent scholarship as to how expansive his campaign was, and maybe it wasn't a full pincer action, and it really was just maybe he heading to Albany and General St. Leger or St. Leger heading from the west to reinforce him. But certainly General Clinton did come up. It wasn't imaginary. He did come up and take Forts Clinton and Montgomery with the size of a force of 2,000 to 4,000, and then he burns the new New York State Capitol to the ground, Kingston, on October the 6th. It's hard to fully understand why General Clinton didn't continue further north to Albany to reach Burgoyne. I think it might have been intelligence that, and we'll get to this, but there was a massive turnout of the militia from mostly New England and upstate New York, and I think they probably perhaps knew that there would have been a reckoning if they had gone any further, and that Burgoyne really was, his fate was sealed. But the point is, and maybe for your listeners, the Philadelphia fell on September the 26th, right between the two battles of Saratoga, the Battle of Freeman's Farm, that was a costly victory for the British. They held the field that day, but they didn't take the high ground of Bemis Heights. And but then on October the 7th, the Battle of Bemis Heights, a very decisive tactical victory for the Americans, but Philadelphia fell. So, if Burgoyne then had succeeded in taking Albany, right, the question is he likely would have been controlling most of the corridor from Quebec to New York City, of the Lake Champlain down to Albany, and then would General Clinton have been able to control the rest of the Hudson Valley? So it would, I think it would have been the beginning of the end and a near knockout blow. So that's a lot of talking, but fortunately that didn't happen. And the reason this gets to the, why it's not just me. We have a really large group now of an advisory committee that's emerging to fortify our project. We already have great military historians. It's a veteran-owned project and a lot of military families involved. But we really are widening the circle now because this is a story that must be told. And it must be told, I think, via a major motion picture masterpiece and hopefully a companion multi-episode or multi-season series, sort of like Saving Private Ryan and then A Band of Brothers. Because, and I do a lot of talking, Jake, you're really patient with me here, is, well, here's the really for the point is that what was at stake was they didn't have to come is really my one of the points that I make. The massive turnout of the militia and Dr. James Kirby Martin and both Kevin Weddle and Eric Schnitzer and all of their books and scholarship cover this. They're like a dream team of historians, and there are many others, many of the staff at the Saratoga National Historical Park. But the Continental Army, or the American Army that was dug in the upper Hudson Valley, they were not the equal of Burgoyne's force. And so, but Washington had matured considerably as an overall commander in chief. And he knew that he couldn't just keep all of the assets with his main army. And so particularly when Burgoyne had left Quebec, and then certainly when Fort Ticonderoga fell in early July, there was a mad dash to really quickly fortify the northern department. But geographically, it was the foothills of the Adirondacks and the upper Hudson Valley. So, and what Washington did, four things and the fourth component, I think, was really crucial. But obviously, he sent General Benedict Arnold, and then he sent Colonel Daniel Morgan and his rifle corps of 400 to 500 men. They were these sharpshooters. Their rifles were the best of the day and twice the range of the British muskets. Pardon me, and they wreaked havoc on the British officer corps in both battles. And it's my understanding that Colonel Morgan's rifle corps was the first unit sent in on both Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights. He was the tip of the spear. So it really, you can't overstate how effective Morgan's force was in the battles of Saratoga. But what also General Washington did, so he's obviously sent Morgan and his rifle corps. General Gates had made the decision to send Colonel Thaddeus Kosciuszko up. And even though he wasn't the head engineer, there was another one that was, I'm told, that was in charge of all the bridges and the like. But Kosciuszko was a prodigy. I mean, it's remarkable the contributions he made throughout the war, especially at such a young age. And his fortifications, forced Burgoyne in off of that gauntlet there on the river and into terrain that was favorable to the Americans. And then Washington also sent cannon from his own artillery train. Didn't have to do that, but he did. It showed great wisdom, I think, and judiciousness. But he also then said he had a dire call to arms. And that went out mainly through Major General Benjamin Lincoln, who was in charge of the militia in much of New England and Massachusetts, but also through General John Stark and New Hampshire and Seth Warner in Vermont and others. But they didn't know what that turnout would be. But at the outset, as it's been conveyed to me by the best military historians on this topic, the American Army was roughly in a 1-to-1 ratio with Burgoyne in the early part of late August, early September. But here for your listeners, let's pause just so it really for impact. Over the next 6 weeks, the American Army goes from a 1-to-1 to a 2-to-1 to a 3-to-1 ratio. So much so that they not only have a very decisive victory at Bemis Heights on October the 7th, but then they're able to cut off completely surround, and lay total siege to Burgoyne's starving and shattered army. Now, again, the best minds of the day can discuss whether or not Burgoyne would have been able to limp back with his force to Fort Ticonderoga and then Quebec. Um, I think there's a strong case that he might have been able to do that because, look, no British army had ever surrendered in history. So I think there's sort of a rebuttable presumption that they would have made their way back. Very decimated, of course, maybe a lot of prisoners being taken with the Americans in hot pursuit. But what is, and again, one of the reasons that perhaps Saratoga hasn't been accorded the seriousness or the gravity that I think this victory, this complete strategic victory that it was, perhaps was because of one of the main heroes, Benedict Arnold, who his leadership, his courage, and his heroics on the battlefield, which were in a very timely way and can't be overstated either. And he was grievously wounded on October the 7th at Bemis Heights. But Benedict Arnold himself did not force Burgoyne's surrender. And I always say, let's take a step back. What forced John Burgoyne's army to completely surrender? Because that's the ace in the hole that Benjamin Franklin was given, was the news of Burgoyne's total surrender at Saratoga. And I think there's a strong case to be made. This is the first surge in American history. At the 11th hour, average citizen soldiers who belonged to various state militia, and most of them were farmers, and they were busy with the harvest that time of year. They said to their families and their spouses and to their communities, and I say to their God, and they'd borne much of the burden of the Revolution to date, much of those that were in New England, but they did come. They did answer the call, and they saved the day. The sacred fire of liberty was very close to being extinguished. If the British take both Albany and Philadelphia in rapid succession, the war may drag on, but I think it's hard to make the case that the Americans ultimately succeed, especially without the French coming into the war. So let me pause, Jake, because that's a big mouthful there.
No, that's beautifully stated. I'm glad you brought that up because that's one of the things that I talked about with Kevin. And one of the things that's so inspiring to me is these are regular townspeople. These are regular citizens, regular folks, men who heeded the call of duty to fight for liberty and like you stated, not let that flame of liberty be extinguished. And in doing the work that I do, that is why I do it. I feel that I look back on my ancestors and I look back on American history and I look back on the men and women who have built our nation. And I feel that I have been passed down a flame. I've been passed down a torch, and it's my responsibility to carry that torch and to tell their stories. And it fills me with so much pride as an American to tell those stories and to bring to light the trials and tribulations that our ancestors, our patriots have gone through to keep that flame of liberty burning, to keep America as that beacon on the hill. And to the greater point that you made of kind of zooming out and seeing how all of it is connected and not just looking at the story here at Saratoga and seeing how it's all connected is a great point. And that's one of sort of the epiphanies I've had as I've studied history and developed a more comprehensive understanding of how the events play into each other and lead to the next. I think I really had that epiphany when I was really studying World War II and seeing how that led into the Cold War. And it's crazy because it's all just an ever flowing cycle of history. I was gonna shift the focus a little bit to not just looking at Saratoga as a military victory and a turning point strategically and militarily, but it showed the world that a group of citizens, a ragtag army who was fighting for what they believed in, could stand up to the greatest empire in the world at that time. And that's really what secured that French assistance. And I want to tie it into film here. I think you can really sort of tie this into Rocky. I mean, at the end of the day, it's an underdog story.
Well, there's so many things to talk about here. I loved the former General Colin Powell, and he had thought that the American GI should have been nominated as the person of the 20th century for all that they did in World War I and World War II, et cetera. And and I often quote Ronald Reagan. It was one of my heroes growing up, and he always said to Americans, "Never forget your heroic origins." And it's sometimes that's not the ethos that's sort of inculcated or in the spirit in the schools, and that needs to be fixed truly. But John F. Kennedy himself said in 1961, in January of 1961, the battle for American freedom was begun by the thousands of farmers and tradesmen who made up the Minutemen, citizens who are ready to defend their liberty at a moment's notice. Today, we need a nation of Minutemen, citizens who are not only prepared to take up arms, but citizens who regard the preservation of freedom as a basic purpose of their daily life and who are willing to consciously work and sacrifice for that freedom. The cause of liberty, the cause of America, cannot succeed with any lesser effort. I mean, I don't think you can improve upon that. And also, I would, I love the analogy of the shining city on the hill. And I'm forgetting the wonderful. He's about 103, the American paratrooper who was over at the 80th anniversary on D-Day. And I'm sorry I can't summon his last name now. He said, Jake, exactly what you said. He had a wonderful audience of young French and American um, teenagers in front of him, and he said to him, we are passing you the torch. And Ronald Reagan often said this, that liberty is fragile, and others have said this, of course, too. It must be passed from each generation to the next. So Franklin Roosevelt invoked this in one of his inaugural addresses, but and Thomas Jefferson as well. I mean, the metaphor of the sacred fire of liberty is so powerful, but that torch is indeed something that people must understand, must be firmly grasped by each generation. So yes, we the film needs to bring this out, and it needs to be the main axis by which the story is told.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Especially with the younger generation, I think these histories and these principles are all too easily forgotten, especially in today's divided political climate. I mean, I'm a political junkie. I love politics and I love studying it. But I think it's much more important to look past that and relish in our shared history, because that's what's important here. And that's really, I mean, I don't want to speak for you, but that's really the true meaning of this film. Is it's not a telling of the Battle of Saratoga and what happened there. It's not a telling of the history there. It's a celebration of the history and the men who built America.
Absolutely, Jake. And I could have bought a home once I paid off my student loans, but I just had this gnawing voice that this was something that had to be done. I did have a partner for a time. The project was based in California. We tried to get the studios to take this. So if the studios are listening, shame on you. There's too many zombie movies and remakes of the Marvel comic stuff. I mean, that's all so trite and hackneyed. I mean, especially with this commemorative period, what's the other the vampires and the zombies? They come on, that's just a wasteland of nonsense. Maybe it sells all the horror movies and the gratuitous violence. Like, no, our history is really worth telling, and especially done in an incredible way. And we knew that Ken Burns was going to come in and do a multi-part series on the Revolution. That was likely, and he's going to release that next year. But even Ken Burns, who's a master of his genre, but he's getting a little bit too much of a bent. And I've talked about this in the last piece, the evil institution of slavery. And it was a global institution, and we did reckon with that with the terrible Civil War. But the existence of slavery at the time of our founding does not nullify our founding or the Great Experiment. I mean, that was a demon that we had to slay, or a dragon we had to slay, and we did. But it doesn't. We shouldn't be ashamed to talk about this incredibly important, vitally important story. There's so many things I want to add, but maybe for your listeners, why should you believe in not only me but this project? When I was an Eagle Scout, I did a Vietnam Veterans Memorial in my hometown. I didn't like the way Vietnam veterans were treated when they returned, and the park in East Northport, New York, didn't have a memorial for Vietnam veterans. It was for every other war, and so we fixed that. And I did encounter a lot of resistance, but ultimately that monument, that memorial, still is there. And I was proud that it made Boys Life magazine all those years ago in 1987. As a result of that, I got to go to the Congressional Youth Leadership Program in Washington, D.C., the very week that Ronald Reagan was meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev in Washington. But I had unexpectedly the honor of helping to lay the wreath at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier as a high school senior. And later, I'm part of the lineage of America's fighting force in that I served in the U.S. Army, but all of my relatives were Irish immigrants, so we really didn't have roots that were here at the time of the Revolution. But it doesn't, and in any way, lessen our zeal, my family's zeal for the story of America. In fact, we're so grateful and profoundly indebted to America. But maybe last point on this is I even recently did a very large family inscription out at the Immigrant Wall of Honor at Ellis Island because of my grandfather had two aunts and an uncle who were responsible for bringing over about 25 nieces and nephews over a 30 to 40 year period. And so we finally codified that on that wall. And so I've always been trying to make sure that certain stories aren't forgotten. And I want to pause because, and we'll talk about the story, the movie and the film here in a minute, but there are so many institutions and organizations doing vitally important work in this space, and you want to thank them all. But the American Battlefield Trust and Mount Vernon, Fort Ticonderoga, of course, the Saratoga National Historical Park, and others. And so, and we need to keep that sustained. And I want Americans to know that this 250th period should not just be celebrated in 2026 for the 250th of the signing of the Declaration, the ratification of the Declaration of Independence, but the entirety of the 8-year period. So, and that's, we want to link in everyone's mind that without Saratoga, we don't get to Yorktown. And I said on the last podcast I was on, Benjamin Franklin got it, right? I mean, he was one of our greatest Americans. If he and Washington, arguably the two greatest besides Lincoln, and he had a coin minted while he was in Paris. And on that coin was featured the victories at Saratoga and Yorktown, the first two times that a British army was forced to surrender in history. Now, it doesn't at all diminish the importance of other victories and struggles in the Revolution, but it does tell the listeners and the American public that these two victories were uniquely special. And right, one occurred on October the 17th of 1777, and the other one occurred 4 years later, almost to the date, on October the 19th of 1781. And maybe one other quick point on this. And I was astounded. Dr. James Kirby Martin and others reminded me of this. More than half of Washington's force at Yorktown was comprised of of French forces, both under General Rochambeau and, of course, Admiral de Grasse. So, right, we don't win at Yorktown without the French. I mean, we have to say that they were massively important, the French assistance and intervention on the American cause.